Traditional entertainment often seems like the most popular type of content we use as a reference in everything we do, until it is not. In the past few years, some of the most consistently high engagement narratives across TikTok, YouTube, podcasts, and streaming documentaries have not come from this space, but from the real-world true crime cases that continue to circulate long after their initial news moment has passed. And this is where something important becomes visible. True crime is not separate from entertainment in the way we usually assume it. It is one of the most effective forms of entertainment in the modern media, just without being labeled as such. And you don't really understand the true crime if you treat it as the crime-related content purely. Because what we're actually looking at is not the category of content that sits alongside others. It is the narrative system that evolved across centuries of media development and now operates as one of the most stable attention architectures in the modern communication. Hi, I'm Lara and I'm narrative strategist, and I work with founders and companies on how attention is structured, how it forms, and how it holds, and why it repeatedly escapes traditional marketing logic. True crime is one of the clearest places where the system becomes visible in real time. To understand why true crime dominates modern media, we cannot start from podcasts or TikTok. We have to start much earlier with how societies originally consumed crime as a narrative. Long before digital platforms, crime stories were already circulating as printed pamphlets, courtroom summaries, and public account of trials and punishments. These were not neutral reports. They were structured stories designed to explain moral order through real events. What made them compelling was not just what happened, but how meaning was constructed around what happened. There were always three layers already present: a factual layer describing the events, a moral layer interpreting responsibility and the wrongdoing, and a social layer explaining what the event meant for the wider community. These three layers have never disappeared. They have simply migrated into new formats. In broadcast television, crime became episodic reconstruction. In documentary films, it became investigative narrative. In podcasts, it became long-form procedural storytelling. And in social media, it became distributed interpretation. True crime did not suddenly emerge. It adapted itself to every new media structure that it could carry. And each time it adapted, it became more participatory, more continuous, and more socially embedded. Modern true crime is not defined by one mechanism. It is defined by how multiple narrative forces interact at once. There's emotional proximity where audiences feel relevance of the events because they evolve recognizably human situations rather than abstract incidents. There's procedural structure where attention is guided through steps of investigation, evidence, and explanation rather than single revelation. There's narrative authority tension, where different sources, official reports, media coverage, and public interpretation compete to define what's true. And there's interpretive participation, where audiences actively contribute to meaning formation instead of simply receiving it. These elements do not operate independently, they reinforce each other. And this reinforcement is what makes true crime structurally persistent in modern media. We can see this clearly when we look at how specific cases behave inside the system. Let's look at some of the resonant cases that signal the shifts where true crime and entertainment intersect, revealing a narrative system in which the attention loop holds and is truly visible. Remember the Gabby Petito case, the disappearance and killing of a young woman during a road trip with her fiancé. That became one of the clearest examples of how true crime transformed from passive consumption into an active reconstruction. We call it the shift to participatory interpretation. It did not begin in traditional media environments. It began on TikTok and Instagram, where fragmented content, travel videos, relationship interactions, missing person alerts circulated before any complete narrative existed. What mattered was not just visibility, but proximity. The case felt closed because it was already partially documented in everyday media formats before it became news. Audiences began assembling timelines before institutions completed them. This created the shift in narrative authority. Instead of a single source explaining events, thousands of micro-interpretations began forming in parallel. The BBC and the Times later entered the coverage cycle, and they did not create the narratives. They entered an already active interpretive field. Each new update from law enforcement, each body cam release, and each timeline correction did not resolve uncertainty. It reorganized it because the narrative was no longer linear. It was collectively maintained. Another resonant case, the OceanGate Titanic incident. Remember when a privately operated submarine imploded during an expedition to the Titanic wreck? That shows a different structural behavior. Here, attention was not driven by the reconstruction after the fact. It was driven by uncertainty unfolding in the real time. For several days, global audiences were not observing a completed story. They were observing the absence of one. BBC and The Times provided continuous updates, but the intensity of the engagement was amplified across TikTok, YouTube, Reddit, and Instagram, commentary ecosystems where audiences actively constructed extraordinary models of what might have happened. What intensified this case was not only the uncertainty, but a symbolic compression. Visibility, wealth, and technological ambition all converged into a single event. The passengers represented extreme social status. The vessel represented experimental engineering at the edge of safety constraints. And the situation represented complete informational opacity. When these three conditions align, the brain does not treat the event as ordinary news. It treats it as a casual rupture that must be explained. This is why the narrative rapidly shifted from description to explanation, from what is happening to how it is structurally possible. At that point, every fragment of information becomes interpretive material. Technical breakdowns, corporate decisions, and physical explanations are no longer neutral updates. They become competing causal frameworks. And when multiple frameworks emerge simultaneously, the system begins generating parallel explanations. In order to reduce uncertainty, this is the cognitive environment in which conspiracy narrative forms, not as deviation, but as the structural response to unresolved casualty. Even after resolution, the system does not fully close. It shifts into a question of responsibility, system failure, and institutional accountability. And another case, an extraordinary resonant case, which is called the Letby case, involving a conviction of a neonatal nurse accused of murdering and harming infants in a hospital setting. That demonstrates a different mechanism entirely. Here, the driving force is not missing information or real-time uncertainty. It is interpretive difficulty under institutional weight. The narrative is built on medical data, expert disagreement, and procedural interpretation. BBC, The Times, and documentary coverage do not reduce this complexity. They expand it by layering competing analytical perspectives. This changes the nature of attention. It is no longer anchored in curiosity about what happened. It is anchored in the cognitive effort required to stabilize meaning. Audiences are required to process statistical reasoning, expert testimony, and institutional frameworks simultaneously. What sustains attention is not uncertainty about the facts, but instability of interpretation. Each new layer of information does not resolve ambiguity, actually redistributes it across multiple valid but competing readings. So attention remains active not because the story is unknown, but because it is cognitively demanding to stabilize what it means. Across these cases, the same pattern appears in different forms. Gabby Petito shows distributed reconstruction. OceanGate shows real-time symbolic amplification and casual speculations. Lucy Letby shows interpretive complexity and institutional analysis. But in all three, the underlying system behaves the same way. True crime does not function as a linear story that begins, develops, and resolves. It functions as a distributed system of narrative production where meaning is continuously generated across platforms, institutions, and audiences. This is why it migrated so effectively across media history. Print created moral interpretation. Television created structured reconstruction. Podcasts created procedural immersion. Social media created distributed authorship. Each stage increased participation in meaning making. And that is what defines modern true crime. Not consumption, but participation in narrative construction. To understand why this system holds attention so effectively, we need to move from media structure to cognitive structure. Crime is prioritized by the brain because it signals intentional harm, unpredictability, and social risk. But sustained attention is not driven by initial threat detection alone. It is driven by how brain processes unresolved social information over time. One mechanism is threat prioritization, where attention is rapidly allocated to potential danger. Another is prediction formation, where the brain attempts to build models of incomplete information. And another is social cognition, where human intent is continuously reconstructed and evaluated. These systems do not operate in isolation. They reinforce each other, which means attention does not simply respond to crime stories. It enters a continuous loop of interpretation, modeling, and re-evaluation. And modern media systems do not interrupt this process, they extend it. True crime reveals something fundamental about how attention behaves in contemporary media environments. People do not remain engaged because stories are complete. They remain engaged because stories remain structurally active long after their initial presentation. Attention is not held by resolution. It is held by systems that allow meaning to remain in motion. Which means the central question for modern communication is no longer how to create attention. It is how to structure narratives that remain cognitively active across time, platforms, and reinterpretations. Because in modern media systems, the most powerful stories are not the ones that end. They are the ones that continue to evolve inside the audience's understanding of them.